Chapter 17, Section 2 begins with defining systematics, which is the organization of living things into the context of evolution. So organizing living things based on their relationships with one another. Phylogenies are going to be the evolutionary history of a species or taxonomic group. So being able to follow this species or group throughout their history is their phylogeny. And this is used by taxonomists to classify organisms. And they build then a phylogenetic tree, which is going to just kind of be a virtual model of where those relationships are. This is a phylogenetic tree. This is called the tree of life and shows how there are three main branches off of it. Those are going to be our domains, which we'll talk about later, and how things have diverged from an original common ancestor. So at the base of the tree is going to be your oldest ancestor, and then out towards the tips of your branches are going to be the newer groups, how they've changed. This is another example of a phylogenetic tree. This is looking at ancient flagellates and the different phylums that have since developed off of those. Some relationships that are looked at in order to build these phylogenetic trees are the fossil record, and looking at different fossils of organisms, seeing how their ancestors looked in comparison to how modern species look. Also to get a time frame, morphology, so structure and form of the organisms, the embryological patterns of development, so similar to what we talked about in our evolution unit. You can follow how embryos develop of different species and see how they look very similar but start to grow more and more different from one another as they develop and be closer to getting closer to actual birth. And then finally, analyzing DNA, RNA, and proteins. So taking DNA samples and simply comparing how many similar genes and how many different genes that organisms have with one another. Cladistics uses characteristics that are shared between groups. They're called shared derived characters to establish evolutionary relationships. So a derived character is a feature that evolves only within the group that you're looking at. So after a group has split off from the main branch of the tree, and it starts to develop a certain characteristic, that would be a derived character. So like there's no other group that we can really think of that has feathers besides birds. And so that means that the ancestor probably didn't have feathers. It was something that developed after they branched off from their ancestor. So that would be a derived character. And a cladogram is just an ancestry diagram similar to a phylogenetic tree, but it's going to focus on these derived characters. This is an example of one that the ancestor would be down here, and everything above it would have all of these characteristics. But here you start to branch off the lancelet, and it does not have these characteristics up here. It doesn't have a vertebrae column, it doesn't have a jawbone, four-legged locomotion, and so on. Now then the lamprey branches off. Now it has a vertebral column, but it doesn't have jawbones, doesn't have four legs, doesn't have amniotic eggs, doesn't have hair. Then we get to grouper. Okay, it has all of these traits above it, but it has none of these traits below it. So you can see how they've branched off and become more different from one another.